Welcome everyone to the Bunch Center. Thank you so much for being here. We are so happy to welcome our speaker for today. Jonathon Collins is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Political Science here, where he studies urban politics, democratic representation, and racial and ethnic politics. He has been a professor of politics at Pomona College. He's a research fellow for the Loyola Marymount University Center for the Study of Los Angeles, as well as a survey data analyst for national public opinion polling firm Latino Decisions. He's the recipient of numerous research fellowships at UCLA. Jonathon has published research in academic journals, including Harvard Journal of African American Policy and Local Government Studies. He's also served on the Hollywood Studio District Neighborhood Council, and he's an executive board member for the Black Los Angeles Young Democrats. He holds a BA in English from Morehouse College and an MA in African American Studies here from UCLA. Most recently, though, and we congratulate him on being awarded the Brown University Presidential Diversity Postdoctoral Fellowship, which will begin this fall. So please give a round of applause for Jonathon Collins.
Okay, thank you everybody for being in attendance today. Let's see. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. As Anna Christina graciously introduced me, my name is Jonathon Collins, and today I'll be doing my Circle of Thought lecture. This is actually my second Circle of Thought lecture, so it's a privilege to be back here in the Bunch Center. And today I'll be talking about this idea of potentially a new era of Black politics. Now, before I get started, I want to just say how grateful I am to be back here in the Bunch Center, just because, as I get ready to transition away from UCLA and on to Brown, the Bunch Center was where it all started. It was in 2010 where I first got the opportunity to come here as a Summer Humanities Institute participant, funded by the Bunch Center, produced by the Bunch Center, ran by the Bunch Center, and it was the Bunch Center that gave me an opportunity to become a scholar. So that when I got the opportunity to come and do this talk, I didn't hesitate. I immediately said yes, because I wanted my final talk at UCLA to be in this space, to be at the Bunch Center. Now, this is 2010. A lot less hair, a lot less stress, but in that very room right over there, this is my very first day on UCLA's campus as still an undergraduate student at Morehouse College. So it's just gratifying and really, I can't even explain what it feels like to be in this moment right now, getting ready to present research as I get ready to get my PhD and transition onward. Also, before I get started, I want to just pay some respect to some folks who have been really influential to me. I want to start by acknowledging Dr. Brady Nelson. When I first came into the SHI program, he was my advisor, he was my mentor. He took my writing, he tore it up. He told me I had a long way to go, but he helped me get there. And he started the beating up process that I was gonna have to take as a graduate student. But he did it with love and care to show me that you can improve and you have what it takes to succeed. You just have to be willing, right, to be malleable, to be molded, right, and to take criticism and get better. He passed away in 2015, and I miss him, and I miss our conversations, and I miss his support, and I'm grateful for his life and his commitment, because I wouldn't be here without him. And I have to acknowledge Mark Q. Sawyer, who, when I was a Summer Humanities Institute participant, the final speaker for the program, the final lecturer, walks in one day, and he's this cool looking black dude, and he's got on like some green linen pants and like a white tunic. He was like he was like fresh off an island somewhere. Like he just like was living life. He didn't have a care in the world. And he sat down, and his brilliance just trapezed around the room. And from that moment, I said, I want to be like that guy. I want to be just like that guy. I want to be everything that this guy is. He's brilliant, he's cool, he's smart, he's sure of himself. That's who I wanted to be. And I was lucky enough to have him mentor me and bring me into the African American Studies Master's program and bring me into the PhD in Political Science program. And not only just his intellectual ability was influential with me, it was just who he was as a person, how he showed me how to be a better scholar, but a better person. And I don't even know what I said in this moment. I really don't. It was probably something stupid, you know what I mean? But I just love this moment because it really captured our relationship, where Mark really allowed me to be myself. You come into the graduate program, and there's so many expectations, and especially being in a program like UCLA. But Mark was very true to himself, and his mentorship approach was to allow others to be true to themselves as well. So it's because of Mark that I was able to not only get through the program, and come out as the same person I feel like I was when I entered. Right? It's because of Mark, and I thank Mark. I thank you for everything that you've done for me. And I'm sad that I have to do this and you're not here physically, but I will never forget your contributions, and I'm just grateful for the experience to have known you and be a part of your legacy. So, as I transition from sort of paying my respects, as is due for the people who have paved the way for me, now I want to transition to talking about myself and kind of what I do and how I got to this point of sort of working on the project that I'm working on today. So my primary research areas largely center around the idea of race, political behavior, and policy. If you look at the things that I work on, they're all sort of loosely or tightly connected to those three concepts: race, political behavior, and public policy. So I have my dissertation that looks at deliberation, race, and local politics, how deliberative democracy, racial conflict, and empowerment can shape political behavior at the school district level. I have another working paper about deliberative democracy and elite attitudes toward public engagement. I have a paper that I've gotten published on social capital and district spending. I've looked at racial attitudes and federal support for spending towards childcare. And I have the line of research that I'm working on today, presenting on today, which is about African American political behavior and differences in age cohorts. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of what I'll be discussing over the course of the remainder of our time. We're looking at background research questions, the literature on kind of what people have been saying, theoretical framework, my idea of what I think is going on, my research design, how I go about sort of proving or testing or engaging in this kind of work, and then some results, a lot of different graphs. You're just going to see a lot of graphs, a lot of graphs. And open up for Q&A. I think it's very important to have the opportunity to bounce this idea off of you all. I'm thankful for the brilliance that you brought into the room, and I want to know, what do you think about the project? What do you think is going on? When you think about sort of African American politics, or folks you know, folks you interact with, what do you think is happening? Do you buy what I'm selling? Do you think there's something else going on? I really want to hear from you. So, the project is really interested in this larger question of, are we entering a new era of black politics? All right, so all this stuff has happened. We've elected the first African American president. Then we've had Black Lives Matter in response to filmed instances of police shootings. Then we have Trump. We have a Secretary of Education who thinks HBCUs are school choice. We have all of this crazy stuff going on, and African Americans are kind of experiencing this. So the question becomes, are we entering kind of a new era of black politics that may be responding to these differences, these different events that are starting to take place? I answered the question really before the election. I started thinking about this when this event happens. So it's like April, leading into the election. I think this is in the aftermath of the Dallas protests, where Black Lives Matter organized a protest, and a couple of folks went rogue, and I think a Dallas police officer was shot. All right. So Obama's in London, and during the Q&A, somebody asked him about Black Lives Matter, what's going on with BLM? And he responds, you can't just keep on yelling. Right? You can't just keep on yelling, right? So give you the full quote. You can't just keep on yelling at them, and you can't refuse to meet because that might compromise the purity of your position. The value of social movements and activism is to get you at the table, get you in the room, and then start trying to figure out how this problem is going to be solved. You then have a responsibility to prepare an agenda that is achievable, that can institutionalize the changes you seek, and you seek, and to engage the other side. So it's really vintage Obama, right? Can't we all just come together and kumbaya and hold hands and compromise? Right? Why can't we just have a conversation and come to some sort of agreement or some sort of understanding amongst ourselves? So, in light of this conversation, Obama invites Black Lives Matter activists to the White House to meet with him. And it also invites UC John Lewis, Valerie Jarrett, White House insider, Al Sharpton. Right? He wanted to really have this sort of dialogue with Black Lives Matter. Now, one activist declines the invitation to meet in the White House. And not only does she decline the invitation to meet at the White House, she releases an essay on her blog, right, really detailing why she didn't want to participate in the conversation. Exum Pulley writes, I was under the impression that a meeting was being organized to facilitate a genuine exchange on the matters facing millions of Black and brown people in the United States. Instead, what was arranged was basically a photo opportunity and a 90-second soundbite for the president. I could not, with any integrity, participate in such a sham that would only serve to legitimize the false narrative that the government is working to end police brutality and the institutional racism that fuels it. With the increasing number of families fighting for justice and dignity for their kin slain by the police, I refuse to give its perpetrators and enablers political cover by making an appearance among them. All right? So she's not having it. She's not buying it. She doesn't want to go to the White House. She doesn't want to shake Obama's hand. She doesn't want a photo op. She wants to continue the resistance. So this question becomes, right, what's going on with this divide between Obama and Black Lives Matter? But more substantively, is there something going on that extends beyond just Obama and Black Lives Matter in this sort of division? In particular, are we seeing generational differences emerge? Is it the Obama generation versus the Black Lives Matter generation, as opposed to simply just Black Lives Matter versus Obama? Is this a generational difference? Are these differences the result of different generational experiences? Obama, Chicago, Mayor Harold Washington, Jesse Jackson, Junior Anderson, right? Versus Black Lives Matter, Obama's presidency, but again, these filmed instances of Black people slain by the police. Different experiences. Could these different generational experiences be transitioning us into a new era of Black politics, right? And if so, is Black politics actually making a postmodern shift from an emphasis on politics back to what we saw in the sort of the 1970s, 1960s, towards an emphasis on protest? So I made this graph because I used to hate making graphs, but then like sometimes you find out that graphs are really useful. So I made this graph because I thought it was like a really useful graph. So what this graph is saying is showing you that just sheer frequency, the number of black folks in Congress over time, starting in 1860 up to present. And what you see is some pretty stark differences if you cut it up into different time periods. You'll see a little uptick in sort of after the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, flat lines in the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, Jim Crow kicks in. You see a little bit of an uptick after the crash and migration is happening, but then it really just explodes here in the 60s after the Civil Rights movement. Then it kind of really up explodes again in the 80s. With, the Jesse Jackson stuff going on. And then it seems like it kind of like tapers off, uptick a little bit with Obama, but we're not seeing the same kind of explosion in representation that we saw in these other these other eras, especially this sort of main 60 to 80 era. So the question becomes, are we experiencing a decline in sort of the power of representation? Is descriptive representation amongst African Americans actually plateaued? Have we reached this point where, we're not making these historic gains anymore, so it's really not as much about like putting black people in office? Is it about something else? Or could it be the fact that a new generation is maybe emerging, is asking for this something different? Now, why is this important thinking about descriptive representation? Because black candidates contending for political offices has been a major source of political mobilization. One of the primary reasons why African Americans have shown up at the polls consistently is because they have opportunities to see a black person on the ballot. But we see that these historic gains have the initial mobilization, but then it kind of plateaus over time. So the first time a black person runs for Congress or city council or the mayor, there's this huge black turnout. Then a re-election happens, and then you kind of see it plateau a little bit. And we see this consistently across congressional, state, and municipal elections, right? Historic turnouts, but then it plateaus. What I want to argue is this plateauing is really just the development of a new generation of folks who are coming to the table with different political ideas or different conceptualizations of how they want politics to work, right? That maybe it's the older folks who are still turning out for those African Americans that are still empowered. Maybe you're seeing a sort of a shift to a new generation who maybe are looking for something different because they're a little bit used to it. They've seen Maxine Waters for a long time. They've seen John Lewis for a while. So maybe they're looking for something different. So I developed sort of a cohort model of black political behavior that I think kind of gets at what I think is probably going on. Now, the problem is nobody has really talked about African Americans as like a group that may be different across age groups or cohorts. There's studies of cohorts, predominantly white voters, where they show that you see these kind of different cohort effects leading to political socialization and partisanship formation. You got studies that look at Latinx and Asian Americans who look at differences between first gen and second gen, third gen. We acknowledge that these kind of generational differences are very important for political behavior. But when it comes to African Americans, we haven't really thought about aging in cohorts and this being something that actually could matter. The few work that does either looks explicitly at youth politics and organizing, or they look at changes in the social or economic conditions and not really focused on the kind of political events that might be happening and changing African American political behavior amongst these different generational cohorts. So that's where I feel like that's the gap that I'm trying to fill here. This project places at the center this interaction between political events and the sort of black mobilization that we've seen through sort of linked fate, this in-group heuristic that's established amongst African Americans where you can see yourself as someone tied to someone else who also identifies as African American. What happens to me has direct consequences for what happens to someone else who's in my same in-group. So I'm positing a new model that looks like this, at its simplest form. You start with the idea of sort of linked faith, buying into sort of group consciousness, wokeness, if you want to really, really, really simplify it. You transition to your sense of linked faith interacts with exposure to a political event, so especially during early adulthood. So you're 18 to 25, and for some reason you develop this kind of in-group consciousness as an African American, and then Black Lives Matter happens, or then the Civil Rights Movement happens, or then Jesse Jackson runs for president. So these different events interacting with your sense of linked faith should influence how you develop ideas in terms of what course of political participation is the most advantageous for producing a black agenda, right? So you should think that if you are exposed to protests at an early age, throughout your life, we should expect you to think protest is a powerful means of producing social change. Whereas if you're exposed to mass increases of voting or elected or descriptive representation, then you should think that electoral politics should be the route. It maps onto the cohorts that we have kind of now in a way that looks like this, the voting age cohorts. You get the silent generation, primarily experiencing Jim Crow. You get the baby boomers, the black baby boomers, who experienced kind of civil rights movement during early adulthood. Gen Xers, who experienced this massive increase in electoral gains in early adulthood. And then you get the millennials, who have this kind of weird, wonky thing going on where there's like a first black president, but then there's Black Lives Matter and police shootings, and it's just, right, you're exposed to all these different things during a very transformative period during your sort of political life. So, hypotheses. I'm expecting linked faith to correlate positively with feelings of efficacy towards voting, protest, and because it's become a major source of political participation and political action and political engagement in social media. I'm expecting that this relationship will look different for the different cohorts. And then I'm expecting that this relationship will reflect the cohort-wide exposure to these different events. So again, the cohort-wide exposure to protests during early adulthood, or the cohort-wide exposure to voting during the early adulthood. So I go about this by just comparing black cohorts. I get data, I chop it up based on the age cohort that they are affiliated with, and I compare them and see if there are any differences. I do this with two different types of data sets. So I first pull the ADS, American National Election Survey. They have a cumulative file that goes from 1948 to 2012. It's a total of about 55,000 cases. I pull the African Americans from that sample. You get about 6,500 cases. And I break them down by cohorts. You get your millennials, 36%, your Gen Xers, your boomers, and a small silent generation, because they only use the questions that were asked over time. And a lot of the questions that were asked to the silent generation didn't necessarily make the cut for the cumulative file, but there's enough there to at least kind of draw some emphasis. But because it stops with 2012, and as we see in the framing of the project, all of this stuff happens after 2012, right? So we need to be looking at 2016 as well. ANES hasn't incorporated 2016 yet into the cumulative file. I don't even think they've made the 2016 data set available. So as a result, I went with some 2016 data I was able to collect through working with Latino Decisions. Again, slice the data up by cohort and give us an opportunity to compare and see if there are some generational differences amongst these African Americans, and if we can find some sort of common link or trend or thing. So the methods, again, just dividing it up. I'm going to look at partisanship trends, I'm going to look at voting trends, I'm going to look at protest trends, and I'm going to look at media use. And then I'm going to do some regression analysis where I really test this relationship that I'm proposing in the model, which is linked faith and feelings toward these different sort of political participations. So the 2016 election. Yeah. I couldn't even look at this for a while. It took me a while to even be able to look at this. But I wanted to see, again, there should be some differences happening across cohort, and we should see that relatively consistently as we look at different areas. And the 2016 election, given all of the discussion in the media, should be one of those places where we should expect to find differences amongst these cohorts in terms of how they were responding or thinking about the 2016 election. And we see some evidence of that. We see the silent generation and the boomers were much more enthusiastic about the election heading into the actual election day. They were also stronger Democrats, or identifying more strongly as Democrats. But then we see the reasons why the different generations were voting differed, whereas the millennials and Gen Xers were more motivated to vote to stop Donald Trump, to deliberately stop Donald Trump from entering the White House. You see the silent and the boomers were actually more supportive of Hillary. They were actually more sort of mobilized by Hillary Clinton herself. So, but then we look at this, I look at this idea of policing, because this was also sort of a hot topic that was going on during the election, especially amongst African-American circles. And again, we start to see these generational differences take place. Millennials were the kind of spearheading the group in terms of supporting demilitarizing the police. We see that, but actually it was the boomers who seemed more supportive of the idea of like being exposed to. They said that when they were seeing shootings on TV made them want to go and vote, whereas millennials were the least likely to actually want to vote based on seeing those police shootings. And then, but when it comes to police brutality, or are you worried about you or someone you know being a victim of police brutality, we see relatively similar levels. Right? So the concern with police brutality is relatively even, but right, the strategy in terms of demilitarizing the police, as well as like mobilizing on behalf of police shootings, we see some differences when we start to break it down by cohort. News consumption. This could also play a different role, play a role here. And we see, again, some pretty stark differences across cohorts. We see that, you know, Gen Xers are the highest cohort consuming newspapers as their primary news source. The boomers and the silent generation are relying more on TV and radio. But then, as we would expect, it's the millennials who are really relying on social media. 37% said that their primary source of news was social media. But then I get to what I'm centrally interested in this project, which is the sense of efficacy towards these different political behaviors. Which ones do you see as the viable route for African Americans to take to advance as a group? And how does this interact with your sense of group consciousness, your sense of linked faith, how tied your life is to another African American's life? And again, we see these cohort differences like begin to shape out. Social media efficacy, as we would expect, the younger cohorts, Gen Xers and millennials, seem to have a higher sense of social media efficacy. And this is just, you think that social media is more important than voting. Protest efficacy, we see a different kind of pattern where it's actually the boomers, the civil rights generation, and the millennials' exposure to Black Lives Matter, who are the ones who held a higher sense of efficacy towards protest, right? In the sense where you think protest is more important than voting. And then the vote efficacy kind of looks as we would expect it, right? It's the older cohorts, the silent generation, and the boomers who believe that my vote could actually translate into policy changes, right? And that's how we're defining vote efficacy. My vote actually translates into policy changes. And we see the silent generation and the boomers are more likely to buy into this concept. But we see relatively similar levels of linked faith across cohorts, except maybe the silent generation is demonstrating higher levels of linked faith. Smaller sample though, I think if we had a fuller sample, you would see these differences are almost exactly the same. So different in terms of their sense of efficacy, relatively similar in terms of their sense of group consciousness. The question becomes, how do the two interact? If your linked faith is similar, but your sense of efficacy is different, what's going on? What's performing differently? Is it the linked faith that's performing differently? Or is it the sense of efficacy that's performing differently? What I'm finding is differences in efficacy based on linked faith. So this is a plot of the regression models that I run for each cohort, using linked faith to predict sense of vote efficacy. So this is the idea that group consciousness, your sense of me, another African American, and I, we share the same kind of life outcome or life outlook. What happens to me directly impacts what happens to you. I very much believe that. The millennials who believe that also demonstrated higher senses of vote efficacy to the extent to where they believe that their vote could actually translate into policy gains. We don't see that relationship with Gen X. So that means regardless of your sense of linked faith, if you're in Gen X, you're also having the same levels of vote efficacy. So you can have high vote efficacy, whether you have group consciousness or not. You can have low vote efficacy, whether you have linked faith or consciousness or not. But boomers are almost mirroring millennials, where their sense of linked faith is very much tied to vote efficacy, or I say the other way around. Your vote efficacy is very much tied to your sense of linked faith, where it really is this kind of in-group heuristic. It's really like some strong in-group identity that's motivating voting for the millennials and the boomers. But Gen X, who's kind of used to this? They grew up with a number of elected officials. They seem to not necessarily need that connection with group consciousness to go out and vote and show up at the polls. We look at protest efficacy, and then it looks different. We still see cohort differences, but even the pattern changes. So again, millennials, their linked faith is again tied to some sort of efficacy. This time, it's the idea that protest is more important than voting. But Gen Xers are also on that same sort of wavelength, where their sense of linked faith is tied to their sort of protest efficacy. But with boomers, we see a negative relationship. So boomers who have high senses of in-group consciousness and linked faith are less likely to hold a sense of protest efficacy and think that protest is more important than voting, which is what you would expect from the civil rights generation who use protest as a means to achieve voting rights. And with the silence, we see pretty much an indistinguishable relationship. Social media efficacy. We see the same pattern that we saw with vote efficacy, where it's millennials, as we expect, their sense of linked faith is also tied to their belief in protest as this powerful political mechanism. But the baby boomers, right, despite, again, they have significantly lower levels of social media use, but the social media, the boomers who do buy into the concept of linked faith, right, are significantly more likely to see social media as this powerful mobilizing tool, most likely because of the protests that emerge from social media that seem to resemble a lot of what took place during the civil rights movement. So I wanted to really illustrate like these differences of like what it really means to go from sort of a low level of group consciousness to a high level of group consciousness of linked faith for each cohort and for each behavior. And you see that, again, there's an impact, but it's different for each cohort. For millennials, going from, the blue bar is, for instance, going from low level of linked faith to a high level of linked faith, leads to a 13% increase in vote efficacy, a 17% increase in protest efficacy, and only a 4% increase in social media efficacy. When you look at Gen X, your linked faith has pretty much has no effect on your sense of vote efficacy, literally zero. Going from low linked faith to high linked faith, if you're in Gen X, has no relationship with your sense of protest efficacy, your sense of vote efficacy. But we see a pretty strong relationship with the probability of developing protest efficacy, 16% percentage points more likely, right, to develop or demonstrate protest efficacy if you are high in linked faith versus someone who's low in linked faith. And then 7% change for social media. You look at the boomers, and you see relatively high levels for all three, whereas linked faith really seems to be having an influence for all three behaviors, but it's obviously strongest for voting. Then you see with the silent generation, their lowest is protest, which you think about the silent generation, Jim Crow, lynchings, right? This generation you would expect to be more kind of averse to the idea of protest because the consequences were much higher for the silent generation than the other cohorts. So, but this was just a snapshot into 1 year, and I kept getting these questions about how reliable these differences may be over time, and what would happen if I looked at other surveys. So then I bring in the cumulative file, and I look at and again, these are just averages, these are just means, so they haven't been modeled or anything like that, but you can still see these differences in partisan, in sort of partisan identity or partisan affiliation amongst African Americans who are part of different cohorts. Even historically, over time, the millennials are less likely to identify as Democrats. You see that it's the boomers that seem to care the most about which party wins the president, as well as which party wins congressional elections. But then you also see, I like this I like these two variables because I think they really illustrate what might be going on in terms of this transition, this generational transition, where you see that the Gen Xers and the millennials are the least likely to identify as strong Democrats, but they're the most likely to report that their parents were Democrats. So you have a little bit of a sort of a status quo movement going on, but there's also some party realignment stuff going on in here too, where the silent parents were Republicans, because that was the party that African Americans were mostly affiliated with during the time. But I think this transition from the parents acknowledging the strong affiliation amongst parents, yet demonstrating the weak affiliation amongst themselves, really shows this kind of transition of what's taking place, right? This kind of movement on behalf of the younger generation of African American voters. And then speaking of voters, we look at kind of just voting, ideas about voting. And you see that the silent generation and the boomers seem to think that their group as a whole has more of a say, although the differences aren't very big, relatively the same. But when you think about the idea of voting is the only way to have a say in the political system, but then baby boomers really emerge to the forefront. Again, the protest, this is the protest to politics generation, right? We protested for the access to the ballot. Voting is the only way to have a say. And then the idea that voting matters. The silent generation seems to kind of lag behind the pack. Again, experiences with Jim Crow and de jure segregation and actual voting mechanisms put in place to deliberately prevent them from voting. You know, maybe this is having a role, it is sort of playing a role in their sense of efficacy towards the idea of voting matters altogether. Protests, looking at different types of protests. And again, the trend is the same. Gen Xers and millennials approve the demonstrations, they approve civil disobedience, and then they approve protests sort of widely defined. So the conclusion that I've reached in this project so far is we can say that there is evidence suggesting that African Americans' views towards political participation methods do differ by age cohort. This appears to be due to linked fate performing differently across cohorts. And then the plateauing of descriptive representation, it actually may be due to changes in the way group consciousness is being activated for each cohort. Right? And then the final thing is that this is very much a project in the works. I definitely want to continue this line of research down the road. Although it's not my primary research, it is a project that I'm really interested in and I find very fascinating. So, but more work needs to be done to better understand the complexity of African American generational cohorts. I think African Americans have been typecasted as such a homogenous group that we're slowly starting to acknowledge differences within the Black community. But this is an area where we haven't really thought about it scientifically. We acknowledge class differences, we've even started to acknowledge differences in skin tone. We've acknowledged differences in place and region. But we haven't really thought about differences in cohorts and aging over time. And I think there's some sort of scientific evidence to support the idea that this has happened, but we can only really know if we put more time and effort into this work. So, thank you. So,
We have time for questions.
yeah. Anybody have questions? What do you think? Buy, sell, no?
I have a question. You mentioned the activation of group consciousness. Now, the activation of group consciousness with baby boomers differs from the activation of group consciousness of millennials. Could we say that they're both underlined by reactive politics rather than proactive? Or are we now seeing more proactivity in the activation of group consciousness because of the abundance of Black Lives Matter, as opposed to baby boomers, where group consciousness activation could not benefit from the abundance of, I guess, visual, however we want to say what we see today nowadays?
I think I can see it going either way. I think that I really am more in line to agree with the first idea, that it would be reactionary. because, you know, it is kind of responding to instances into clear instances of racial injustice. Whereas, you know, you look at Gen X, and I don't know if you really see that with the Gen Xers, to where there is really something to react to. I get the Rodney King question a lot, but to me, it didn't have the same national impact and the same kind of national level of coordination that we saw with the civil rights movement amongst the baby boomers, and then also what we're seeing with millennials in terms of Black Lives Matter. So I definitely think they're reacting. I definitely think, I would even push back and say that the television images, I mean, TV was the social media at that time. So, you know, broadcasting images of the water hoses, I mean, obviously that was a powerful mobilizing tool where people were very much reacting to these images if they were seeing the same way that, or not the same, but I would say at least a similar or parallel way to you see reactions to armed violence against African Americans on behalf of police. I think, you know, there is a reactionary component there. It's tough to disentangle that from your second idea, because there's a cyclical effect, right? There's a looping that happens, because there are some people who are reacting to the images, but then those people react and they create the movement, and then other people are being proactive to be a part of the movement because they see the movement rolling. So it's going to be different maybe for different people. I'm not even quite sure how to isolate what would determine who is reacting versus who is being proactive. I'm not even sure that lead fate or consciousness can even tell you, because I don't know if it's fair to say that just because I lack some sort of, well, just because I didn't get in at the forefront of the movement and react at the forefront of the movement doesn't mean I don't have group consciousness. So I could have group consciousness and still just react late, or I could have group consciousness and I could be reactive to the initial event, marching on the streets from day one. So it's really tough to disentangle, which I think is a good thing. I like these kind of problems that are kind of tough to solve. You know, it's like, it's really chicken or the egg, and when social movements happen, they just happen, and it's so organic, and each one's so different, it's hard to pinpoint systematically what is happening. But I think I would be more inclined to agree with your first point, that it would be more, the difference would really be this link fate activated by kind of reactionary circumstances. But I can see it working other ways too. I don't know if that was helpful.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, Dr. Tuttle.
First, thank you very much for this presentation. It really got me thinking, and I'm confident others around here too. I had a couple of observations on the.
I won't ask you your cohort either.
Oh, I'm right in the middle of what's called the silent generation. That actually enables me to make this first of 2 points. That is, at Shaw University in 1960, there was a gathering of people who became known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. People involved, after all, with the sit-ins and the lunch counters and so on, and so on. And there's certain features of what is taking place, or what did take place, with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Black Lives Matter cohort. And there may be, so my first observation is, in the silent generation slicing of the data, on the back end of it, in other words, Julian Bond, born 1940, John Lewis, born 1940, this is before the boomers. Boomers are defined as after the war, the GIs come home. There's the shock troops, widely, that's not an original phrase for the SNCC, and others. I don't want to diminish others. There were others who were part of this too. And as you work this, if it's possible to slice the data, you might find that of interest to look at it a little bit differently. The second observation I have is SNCC has put together research components, so have others, Clay Carson, Dr. Clay Carson up at Stanford, who's on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is a heck of a starting point for anyone. All suggests that there may be a lot of material. But also Tom Hayden, in a memoir he did, actually counted in a footnote the number of people who went to jail in 1963 for civil rights. And it got almost to that Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson thing, where Thoreau, member, went to jail to protest the Mexican War because he knew it would expand slavery. And Ralph Waldo Emerson went to him and said, "What are you doing in there, Henry?" And Henry David Thoreau said, "What are you doing out there?" You got to the point where if you were young, vigorous, conscious, and you weren't in jail, there was that kind. So there's some data points that, and maybe get names. These little things are so darn powerful. Look everybody up. I just looked up the lady who wouldn't go, Chicago, Black Lives Matter, easy to find her. There are all sorts of ways to find people that didn't exist. And which brings me to another observation. You were getting into this causation question, which the gentleman asked. You alluded very accurately to, just because people have been silent, it doesn't mean there's not a past. And the classic example is Ms. Rosa Parks. We all know she had deep political involvement. Everyone in this room knows that before. The portrayal was a lady sitting on the bus, but she had very deep involvement. And I think you probably find roots in organizations from elders and others. So that would be one cohort. And then another cohort which suggests itself is the Black Lives Matter men and women who are involved. There are obviously gender issues that have to be sorted out here too. But that would suggest components of your research, and it got me thinking about it just for the lay. I have some other observations, but I'll yield the floor right now.
Well, if I could, I wouldn't necessarily say respond, but just kind of keep your thoughts alive for a second. I think it's a great idea to really think about where like specific figures may fit into these different cohort paradigms and kind of show one of the things that is kind of a limitation of using the cohort as a definition where there's overlap. Like you said, there's Julian Bond, who's technically a silent, but was one of the major figures for the kind of boomer civil rights generation that I'm trying to label. And I have to be able to, or at least acknowledge that is a key factor. I mean, one of the ways one of the ways I'm trying to intellectually get around that is the idea that Julian Bond and John Lewis were not typical from their cohort. They were actually that's part of their courage. That's part of what made them so heroic, was their willingness to say, no, we're going to do this. When the kind of status quo or kind of mainline thinking amongst the cohort as a whole is that we're going to die. So some of those figures become outliers, I think, but in a good way. But then they set the tone for the next cohort, I think. And I have to situate how these outliers could potentially be setting the tone for the following cohort.
I'm with you on this. By the way, the way we ride around this in a design is a big footnote. Having said that, though, back to the causation issue, I don't know this gentleman in front of me, but since he raised the blanket, it may be a way to approach it. And this number of arrests is interesting. I didn't remember. I happen to remember from his memoir in the footnote. I never looked into where he got his data and so on. His career was that of a journalist. He probably had sources on it, and that may go bingo right to your point. In other words, 1963. You're 20. If you're 23, you're born in 40. So do the work, and it may be that a lot of those people arrested were boomers. And if so, you've got some data, that's pretty good, and it's a not well-known little nugget that he came up with, so I hereby yield it back to you, sir.
No, I think that's,
You got me turning on it.
no, I think that's great. If I could go back and pull the arrest records, especially for kind of like civil disobedience and
That's what we're talking about. People arrested for civil rights, not in custody for, they may have been charged with all sorts of things. Malicious trespassing, but and where that data exists, maybe the federal archives have it. Maybe U.S. Civil Rights Commission, maybe, I don't know where they have it.
the Federal Bureau might have that data. If I could,
They probably.
if I could get that, and maybe because I think we're on the same way. We would expect it to follow the same trend that I'm proposing these cohorts follow in terms of protest voting, where those two cohorts, we should see some parallel numbers of arrests for these kind of civil disobedient acts amongst boomers and millennials, whereas we should see a drop in that number amongst Gen X. They were arrested for a number of other reasons.
I'm just not sure. I don't know. You're way ahead of me.
But I think that's an excellent suggestion. I could definitely see that as a huge kind of data point or a set of data points that would really speak to what's going on, if it actually follows the trend I expect.
I just want to make sure before asking that question that I'm not misunderstanding something. Could you, related to this causation question, can you talk a little bit more about Gen Xers specifically and why you think they're different?
Gen Xers, they don't always perform the way I expected them to perform.
Well, shoot.
Problem with
Wait,
data, man.
when do you have kids?
But yeah, so I was really conceptualizing the Gen Xers as like the political incorporation, buttoned up, suit and tie generation. You know, like really like we were socialized by by incorporation, by like political incorporation, and taught to vote at a very young age by our parents who were the boomers who were marching for civil rights and that thing. So higher levels of voter registration, formal politics, and you see that in the models too. It's like they're the Gen Xers who were the Gen Xers, when you model them for voting, they actually look more like your kind of white voter. They're, compared to the other cohorts, they're the ones who look more like, SES, their income, their education, they vote more based on those factors as opposed to group consciousness. So that's kind of like how I was kind of seeing the Gen Xers. Not to say that they're all like that, but that's kind of on average what I was thinking might distinguish that, because there wasn't a civil rights movement that was happening.
Okay, then I do have a question.
Sure.
So, so the question is then, is that level of linked fate maybe related to the perception of an other or an out-group group acting upon your group? So what I'm thinking of is during the 80s, you have the crack epidemic.
Yeah.
But that's largely seen as like the fault of individuals, right? You're making a choice to do drugs, and it wasn't really framed as a national sort of systemic issue affecting the Black community as a whole, right? So it's maybe not activating linked fate, even though it is national, right? Whereas Rodney King was just, like you said, sort of a localized thing in LA. And so I'm wondering then, does the linked fate have to do not so much with like what's affecting that the national group is affected, but what is affecting it, and does it have to be like a perception of white folks affecting it or something else?
I'm 100% on board and agreement with that. It's like, because you're capturing kind of the flip side of how I'm characterizing Gen X that I didn't really think about, because it's kind of like, it's the advancement generation where if you see Black success, but I also didn't think about the flip side of that, which is also seeing Black not success and
Ernest Reagan.
yeah, and like conceptualizing that as like a function of anything institutional as opposed to kind of like more like sort of individual consequence. So I definitely think that kind of what you're painting is a fuller description of the Gen X than I am. So I thank you for that, because I can add that to how I'm thinking about it. Let me go ahead and Christine.
Yeah, I was just curious, can you break that out then, like regionally also with Gen Xers? Just because, I mean, I'm a Gen Xer, but I'm, you know, born in '76. And so, you know, for me, I'm a little, I feel like I have a different experience. Well, I'm also Latinx, so you're looking at Black voters, but, you know, I have a different experience from somebody that's, I think the higher end is somebody that's 51 or something, or 52. So, you know, because I experienced Reagan growing up, a child of like the 80s, right? And so my memories, you know, I think are a little different. And then plus where I live, growing up in Los Angeles was, you know, very specific because policing was obviously, you know, a big deal. You know, the corruption, the police brutality, like there was so much corruption, right, going on. And I think it's depending on like what age plus like where you grew up in the U.S. really impacted your feelings maybe about voting. And so I think it would be interesting to see if there anything pops up like regionally, or if you split up Gen Xers like maybe just in half even by age, and seeing like if something comes up.
I think those are great suggestions, because I could definitely see this. I could see a situation where the results are skewing towards people who maybe towards like folks who grew up in the South.
Yeah, exactly, right, you know.
And, you know,
or in the Northeast or something.
And that capturing kind of what was going on the West Coast, which
Yeah.
would probably look, you know, relatively different. It's tricky. I mean, I could see that, but I could also see like you got Tom Bradley. So
Yeah.
and you know, it
But
was.
that was like the height of like with, you know, Gates and stuff, like with the problems with, you know, policing and you know, just the way that there was so much going on. So it depended on like what age you were. So if you could like see like being, you know, an 8-year-old versus being like an 18-year-old, you know, obviously is like a huge difference in how you're experiencing, you know, policing in whatever part of the country you're in, right? So it's just, yeah, I don't know, it's like it's very interesting, kind of just the idea of being like a product of Reagan economics, Reagan, you know, policing, all that stuff. Just because it's like you're either very young and then, or you're just going into college, you know, age or something.
So
How it affected you and your way of thinking of things, of voting and stuff like that.
I think you're right, and I think that is also like a pretty big limitation of the project. And I mean, it's not a huge limitation where like it's not valid, but it's a limitation that you come into when you do this kind of analysis.
Yeah, it's hard. Well, yeah, it's just like, that's the way things are, right? Yeah, no matter what, so you could probably do that for like baby boomers too, but.
I think it kind of gets back to Dr. Toto's point too, where if I slice it differently,
Yeah.
and just like really kind of just play with the slicing of the cohorts to see,
Yeah.
like, you know, are there certain subgroups within the cohorts that are
Exactly,
really,
yeah.
I think that's kind of what you get at.
Yeah,
I might be
exactly.
finding like, I'm finding this subgroup that's
Yeah.
performing the way that I think, but if I look at
Exactly.
these other subgroups, they might actually resemble different cohorts and just look completely different altogether.
Right, yeah,
If I
exactly.
sliced it and looked at Gen
Yeah.
Xers who grew up in California,
Yeah.
especially on the late end of that,
Yeah,
as opposed to the early end.
Yeah.
And,
like their experience, yeah.
yeah, I think you're right. So that's fairly,
Just to play around with it, yeah.
yeah, play around with the cut points.
And see if that affects like.
I always
these
get,
other theories.
I get a lot of criticism with the cut points just because, like, you know, people in political science don't really study aging, but then all of a sudden you do an aging project and everybody knows the cohort generation definitions all of a sudden, and they're all different. So I try to go with something very standard so that
Yeah.
people could, you know, just like objectively like, oh, the government said yes. So
Yeah, or even like millennials, I mean, I always find it interesting, like the range that it covers, because I feel like an 18-year-old is really different from like a 36-year-old right now.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you know, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would think like a 36-year-old is more similar to me than an 18-year-old is, right? So, so that's why I always find it funny that they're included still, like the 36-year-old, or like they're, happy to be like, oh, I'm still a young person or whatever, which is, fine, but it's just funny because I'm like, are you really part of that generation? It just seems weird. But anyways.
Well, if I could interact that with your first point, how people in like big cities try to be young forever?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So maybe there's some of that going on with a 36-year-old still
Yeah.
feeling they're 18. I see that a lot in LA.
Yeah,
Try a 77-year-old.
Ryan, I want to get to you.
Yeah, I think it's time, I think you're done. The screensaver told us. I don't know, but I will keep it short. Just to piggyback off the idea of the distribution of your data. So not just the age within your cohorts, but also I think the NES surveys usually are done over a series of a couple months, right? So
Pre and
within
post, yeah.
within that time period, I know in some studies they use some sort of exogenous shock that happens within that time period to see how people react before and after.
Right.
And so you may see that the Gen Xers are reacting to something that occurred during the survey. And so people that are interviewed before that event may have a different reaction to those that are interviewed after that event. I don't know what event may have occurred, but you may want to look at the time distribution as well.
Oh, that's an excellent point. Because that, I think, so one of the limitations of the cumulative file is that they only keep the stuff that is consistent over time, and they don't really look at the kind of idiosyncratic stuff that could really show kind of movement, especially like in the present now. And I want to go back and like look at each of the data sets separately.
The first thing you did was the 2016 one, right?
Mm-hmm.
The first results you were showing us was from the 2016 data set?
It wasn't the NES though, it was a different data set, which is
Okay.
why like.
Latino sizes.
Right, and I hadn't even looked at post-election 2016 stuff to even see if there were some shocks that happened in 16. So that's something I can start with, get some post-election 16 surveys on African Americans, and see if these things hold up just across like Trump. If that doesn't have an effect, nothing will. So that's a good place to start, and then I can go backwards and try to see, how I can maybe isolate these different changes over.
Even if a group is interviewed on a Monday and something big happens on a Wednesday and another group is interviewed on a Friday, and see what the differences are. That would be cool to see.
I like it. Angie, yeah?
Yeah, so I had a suggestion and maybe a sort of caution. I mean, I agree with everybody's comments about the substantive reason why you need to cut the data up more. But I think that given, if you're gonna continue with the LD data, which is already like 144 cases, if you're gonna cut up those 4 cohorts more, I'd worry that you're gonna have issues in terms of trying to say something about what the data is telling you. And I think and I think definitely a way to get around this, right, is to say, I ran some robustness checks. So what you do is you do cut up the data, but you do add a plus or minus 5 years, maybe plus or minus 7. You do a couple of analyses like that, and you do add it to a footnote and kind of say, even after making my cohorts plus 5 minus 5, I still find the same pattern. So that would be a way to get around it. And then the other thing that I was thinking about would be too was that I think, I don't know the way that if you're modeling them separately if you cut up the cohorts and are modeling them separately,
Yeah.
but it might be better in terms of actually comparison to do them all in one model and have dummies for the cohorts.
I do that too.
And so that might also, might be better in terms of doing the analysis all together and keeping the data set all together. And then the other thing that I was thinking too is that I think this is fascinating because I think you're really pushing the work of Dawson a lot and thinking a lot about like how do blacks get politically sort of socialized and how do they develop the sense of being fit and and I think this is like really amazing work where you're gonna be able to make a huge contribution. And then, what I was thinking too is that you can get so much out of the 2016 CMPS because you have a sample of 3,000 blacks. You're gonna have validated turnout, so you're gonna see who turned out. And you also have a number of measures on other political behavior. So there's protests, there's signing petitions, there's like a whole bunch of other stuff. So you can create indices. In addition to looking at their views on political efficacy and political behaviors, you can actually see like, well, what did they do? Are millennials much more likely to actually protest and have these sort of views? And there's, the questions about BLM that are on there too, which are like amazing. So, so I'm excited for where this is going.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned CMPS because I haven't actually got.
What is that?
So it's the collaborative multiracial post-election survey, and it's been done over the last sort of election cycles. And the 2016 one was a collaborative effort, mainly done by Lori Fraser-Oakley and Matt Barreto in the political science department.
Thank you very much.
They went out and they surveyed African Americans, Latinos, Latinx, Asian Americans, and whites. They a comparable survey of, a comparable sample of each racial group to be able to compare them across groups for a variety of responses. So it's like kind of the only survey of its kind that has a pretty equivalent to it.
Great.
It's like 10,000. It was a sample. It's large. It's very large. 10,000 individuals.
That's huge.
Yeah, and it's like multiracial and multilingual.
UCLA's political sciences baby.
So, real quick, I know I came in late, I'm so sorry.
Hey,
I still love you.
nobody's out of the house, man. So
Right, there you go. So, real quick, in reference to the silent generation you were talking about cohort-wise, look at, from the work I did in Atlanta, Joseph Laurie, Ralph Abernathy, and others, because that might really start to tilt these individuals from outliers to start to reinform some of your conversation around them. A lot of times our older generations kind of get shooed to the side, and so we don't want to necessarily do that because there's a lot of trinkets you could take from that specifically. Joseph Laurie, Abernathy, and those other individuals specifically chose Dr. King to lead their movement. And so you cannot speak about Dr. King without speaking about the individuals who handpicked him, nurtured him, and gave him a platform. So we don't want to miss or assume vacuums exist. Secondly, millennials make sense for 36 to 18-year-olds because there's a lot of us in our 30s who actually raised those teenagers, even if our parents were around, due to the necessity of our parents trying to build careers and lives. So we ended up becoming the main staple. So in past generations, it was our grandparents. But our generation didn't have our grandparents like that, so it was older siblings. So our older siblings became our grandparents and took place of our elders, which gives to my first point why we start to undermine the necessity of our elders in our conversations. And then Gen X, just real quick, was which years? Because I think from what I'm hearing is like 60 to 81.
like 65, I think, to
Okay.
81.
Something like that? Okay, I thought I heard that, okay. And then with the CMPS, 2016, just be conscious. I spent the whole election season down on the Mexican-Texas border, basically in Mexico. And so the results that were grabbed from the research I did down there were astronomically different for people of color, just due to some of the thought processes historically that exist down there around how you buy into what your cultural existence is in America. It didn't align remotely with what you would assume people of color or individuals who are brown would look like ideologically other places in the country, because there was a large populace that was 98.5% Hispanic.
I think those are excellent suggestions, especially like the comment about rethinking silence, the silent generation. And that's why I think, like, when I say the last one was we need more research in this area, we really do. And one of the things that I really need to do is like be able to develop a survey that really focuses specifically on this, where I can ask different, cohort members, how they respond to these different events to really see like how much overlap. Because I would expect, I think what you're describing is also similar to kind of what Anna Christina and Rick have been talking about too, in terms of like, this isn't a smooth cutoff. This is a lot of overlap amongst these cohorts, and I think, it's going to take a design that's really centered on looking at these generational differences to really determine like what the cut point is, whether it's kind of what Angela's describing as kind of a lag, a 5-year kind of lag where it goes maybe +5, -5, maybe you're technically in the silent, but you were born towards the tail end, so you look more like a boomer. Or you can be the bottom tail end of the boomers, kind of look more like a silent, depending on how you're raised or who raised you, and bring to the point about siblings raising siblings as opposed to parents raising, you know, your children, and then like all these things kind of start to matter in terms of like where you overlap into in terms of one cohort versus another. So I think, yeah, you're just like kind of really spot on. I think. Out of time? We're out of time? Can we?
Okay. Oh, I just wanted to add, just thinking about different time periods and what's happening with the Black community, kind of hit on the diversity within the community of what's happening where people are migrating or moving from, like my family immigrated to the country, so like looking at the different demographics of culturally what's happening with the African American community.
That's true.
Yes, sir. Jesse.
Yeah, but I couldn't.
Go right ahead.
The first thing was the literature review where you talked about people who looked at Black cohorts. So Jennifer Hochschild's A New Racial Order, she talks about age cohorts. She kind of gets at Adria's point that younger cohorts could be looking at like how they attribute certain events to certain things at the very Black cohort. Then I would also say maybe look at, I think it's James Taylor, his Black nationalism book.
Oh,
He
yeah.
gets at, in Ryan's point about the idea of every cohort having their own event that can kind of connect them throughout the cohorts, in terms of just like experiences of marginalization or like a pivotal event, like kind of what he's thinking about. The other thing was in terms of like how you frame the model, I got a little confused. I think Angela's been at this too, kind of if you had showed like kind of how you structured the model, because I was confused whether or not it was age cohort influences like political behavior controlling for feelings of link fate, or if it was like link fate cohorts influencing link fate influencing political behavior, which I think that's what you do with the boxes, but I guess kind of in the language I kind of got a little lost in terms of exactly how it's structured. And then I wanted to know like what you were controlling for in your models. And then with the time period thing, I thought, especially with AES, you can create some time period variables and then see if you can create an interaction with those time period variables in the cohorts and see what traction you get there.
Okay. Those are, one, thank you for the literature, because I just don't read enough. I never read enough in grad school, so thank you. I just don't read enough. Two, yeah, talk about the models. Yeah, I did just separate them by cohort. I also had a full model where, at least in the paper version, where I controlled for cohort. And to me, that was one of the things that made this thing interesting to me, is because it really isn't a strong variable. You add age or cohort, it's not overly predictive, because the patterns aren't, for the cohort to really matter, the pattern has to be linear when you control for it, but the pattern isn't linear, so it's boom, sometimes it's Gen X and boomer, sometimes it's millennials and boomers, and sometimes it's millennials and Gen X, and it's all kind of different, so it doesn't really pick up in the models of the variable, which is why I argue for the necessity of disaggregating the data. And then you find more things, different patterns. But yeah, I can definitely just clarify how I'm doing that and why I'm doing that. So,
Okay, so thank you